Hello, it's Foreign News O'Clock on Allnews Nigeria. I am Okweyemi Olugbemi. Here are the headlines for today. Brazil riot. Protesters ransack presidential palace. World leaders condemn riot. Now the news in details. Rioters on Sunday, January 8, invaded and ransacked Brazil's Congress, presidential palace, and Supreme Court. This is a grim echo of the US Capitol riots that occurred 2 years ago by fans of former President Donald Trump. The uprising, which lasted just over 3 hours, marked the severe polarization that still grips the country. The riot came days after the inauguration of leftist President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who defeated Jair Bolsonaro in the October election in one of the tightest presidential races, with just 50.9% of the votes. It also made Mr. Bolsonaro the first president of Brazil to lose his bid for re-election. The current Brazilian president, known as Lula, described the vandals on Sunday as fanatical fascists who did what has never been done in the history of the country. Let's discuss who and what led to the historic protest. The protesters behind the riot are far-right supporters of Mr. Bolsonaro, who disputed the election win of Lula on 30th October 2022. Lula was previously president of Brazil from 2003 to 2011, but narrowly beat Mr. Bolsonaro last year in a runoff vote. Shortly after the election result, Bolsonaro supporters began gathering for the first time outside military bases across Brazil, calling for a military intervention to prevent Lula from returning to office. In November 2022, Bolsonaro supporters held rallies across the country asking for an armed force for intervention. Brazilians flocked outside the regional military facility to denounce what they described as an unfair or stolen election, while defying a recent Supreme Court order to free up roads and public spaces. What fueled the protest? Well, on November 22, 2022, Mr. Bolsonaro challenged the results of the Brazilian election and argued that votes from some machines should be invalidated in a complaint that was later rebuffed by election authorities. Although the Bolsonaro administration has not directly opposed the transition of power, the far-right leader has yet to concede or congratulate his opponent. His supporters have taken the cue and are also refusing to accept the results. In December, Lula's election victory was certified by the Federal Electoral Court. Later that day, Bolsonaro's supporters attempted to invade the federal police headquarters in Brasilia, the capital, which was prompted by the arrest of a pro-Bolsonaro indigenous leader for alleged anti-democratic acts. Protesters have also condemned the shutting down of many pro-Bolsonaro accounts and groups on social media platforms, describing it as akin to censorship. Fast forward to what led to January riot. On Christmas Eve, a man identified as George Washington de Oliveira Soares was arrested for attempting to set off a bomb in protest against Brazil's election results. A copy of his police statement showed he was inspired to build up an arsenal by Mr. Bolsonaro's traditional support of the arming of civilians. And on December 29, 2022, Brazilian police arrested at least 4 people over an alleged coup attempt during riots by Bolsonaro supporters. Lula was sworn in as president for the first time on 1st January 2023. Where he said democracy was the true winner of the presidential election. But it takes the reins of a polarized Brazil. It wasn't always like that, however. When he retired in 2011, it was with 83% approval ratings. A series of scandals led to his imprisonment on corruption charges, which were subsequently annulled. This was the final event before the storming of the Brazilian capital on 8th January by Bolsonaro supporters. Meanwhile, world leaders have expressed concerns and condemned the riots in Brazil. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Sunday afternoon condemned the violence in Brazil's capital and any efforts to undermine democracy in Brazil. President Joe Biden is following the situation closely, and our support for Brazil's democratic institutions is unwavering. Brazil's democracy will not be shaken by violence. Sullivan wrote this on Twitter. Portugal's government also said in a statement that it condemns the acts of violence and disorder that took place in Brazil and pledged support for authorities in restoring order and legality. And that's it on the news. To keep up with all news Nigeria, kindly follow us on all social media platforms displayed on the screen. We will be back with more news updates tomorrow. Until then, stay tuned. I am Opeyemi Olugbe.